I found the note on the kitchen counter. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't even neatly placed. Just a folded piece of lined paper, its edges curling slightly from the heat of the radiator. My wife's handwriting was unmistakable, loopy, familiar, but this time sharp in its finality. We're going to Florida. Move out before we get back. For a long moment I didn't move. My fingers hovered over the paper as if touching it would dissolve the words. Around me, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that had nothing to do with peace. It was the absence of presence, the stillness that comes when normal patterns fracture. I sat down at the kitchen table, letting the note rest between us like a cold, distant guest. I thought of the small tensions that had crept into our lives over the last months. The quiet resentments, the misaligned schedules, the things said in sentences that hung in the air longer than anyone wanted. Nothing screamed betrayal until now, until the ink on paper struck like an announcement rather than a conversation. I put the note down, picked up my phone, and dialed one number. It was precise, controlled. I didn't mutter or hesitate, though inside, 1,000 thoughts tangled themselves into anxious knots. By the time the call connected, my chest had steadied into a rhythm that was both deliberate and unnatural. On the other end, the voice was calm but professional. I spoke succinctly, no emotion leaking into the words. And then, after a brief exchange, the person on the line promised to intervene. Quietly, authoritatively, legally, no threats, no melodrama, just the guarantee that the unexpected would be addressed. I sat back, letting the silence of the house press in again. It was a familiar silence, but now it carried a different weight. My gaze drifted to the living room. Their shoes were still near the doorway, abandoned in the rush to Florida. My child's small backpack rested on the sofa arm, a silent witness to hurried departure. I imagined them in the warmth of the car, on the interstate, oblivious to the quiet shift that had already begun here. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed. I didn't check the clock. Time was secondary to the strange rhythm that had taken over observation, calculation, restraint. I thought about all the past Christmases in this house, the laughter echoing off these same walls, the ornaments blinking softly in false merriment. None of it felt particularly sentimental now, though the memories lingered like shadows, hinting at loss more than nostalgia. When they returned, the air had already changed. The front door opened to a normal jingle of keys, the familiar sounds of footsteps. I met them in the entryway, standing straight, composed, nothing in my expression betraying the hours of anticipation. They froze almost immediately. The note had been simple, yet it had carried a power they had never fully grasped. The person I had called was waiting in the background, unobtrusive but present, a tangible manifestation of authority. My wife's eyes flickered to the slight figure at the doorway, to the papers quietly exchanged, to the unspoken truth that the house was no longer theirs to control as they had assumed. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to gesture. Their shock was audible in the pauses of their sentences, in the faltering tone of my child's voice. For a brief moment, I understood what it meant to be underestimated, to be invisible, and to suddenly occupy space with undeniable presence. It wasn't triumph in the dramatic sense. There was no celebratory laughter, no theatrical declarations. Just a calm clarity, a recognition that control had shifted subtly but unmistakably. My internal storm remained, muted by the conscious restraint I had practiced in these long hours of quiet. Hurt, disappointment, and pride mixed together, each asserting itself without overwhelming the others. I moved through the house later that evening, checking doors, lights, and the ordinary signs of occupancy. Everything seemed the same, yet nothing truly was. Their absence had left room for reflection, for reconsideration, for the recognition that life's patterns were not immutable. The house belonged to me now in the way ownership matters. Not in domination, but in stewardship, in the quiet knowledge that my decisions carried weight. At dinner, I ate alone. The table was unchanged, Yet my presence at it carried an authority I hadn't fully exercised before. I sipped slowly, aware of the subtle vibrations of expectation that had shifted away from me, and toward the external authority that had enforced the boundaries I now inhabited. The calmness in my posture, the deliberate pace of each movement, spoke volumes without needing words. Evening turned to night, lights blinked on the tree, ornaments reflecting soft, warm glows, mocking the absence with gentle cheer. I walked past them, noting the quiet beauty, the dissonance between memory and reality. I didn't feel triumphant, not really. It was more like standing after a long fall, brushing dust from my shoulders and realizing that I could walk again, alone, measured, unhurried. Sleep came later, not restful, but precise. I dreamed not of revenge or reconciliation, but of ordinary mornings in an ordered house, of the small dignity in routines undisturbed by panic or drama. The note, the call, the return of my family, they were all events now crystallized in a moment of quiet authority, a pivot I had orchestrated without spectacle, without malice. By Christmas morning, the house felt different. There was space to breathe, space to think, space to understand that quiet power often comes not from shouting, not from confrontation, but from measured action and the assurance of one's own dignity. My child's room remained untouched. My wife's absence echoing faintly through the hallway, but the equilibrium had subtly shifted. Control had returned, not in grandeur, but in the simple, undeniable fact that I had chosen the moment and executed it with restraint. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply existed, present in my own life, aware that the external and internal consequences of the evening were irreversible yet handled. In the quiet, I found a clarity I had never expected to inherit from betrayal. And in that clarity, I discovered a self-respect that needed no audience, no applause, no vindication. Victory, if it could be called that, was calm, it was quiet, it was mine.